Dr. Pagwin with the Progenext group here to talk about why genetics matter. We spent a little bit of time talking about what genetics are, but now it's time to dive into why we should care. One reason we should care about our genetics is because of rare diseases, and a disease is considered to be rare if it affects less than 200,000 people at any given time. And there's approximately 7,000 different types of rare diseases, and when you combine all of these together, you end up with about 25 to 30 million Americans yearly that are impacted by some kind of rare disease. So although you have to have less than 200,000 cases for each individual disease, when you add up the 7,000 types, you get about 30 million Americans that are impacted, and that's a lot. 50% of those that are impacted are children, with the other 50 having the disease manifestation in adulthood. And some of these diseases are fatal. Quite a few of them are fatal, actually. So what do rare diseases have to do with genetics? Well, 2/3 or about 80% of these rare diseases have some sort of genetic component. What really ends up being one single gene change. So we talked about genes in previous videos and how we have about 20,000 different genes that make us who we are. So you only need to have one out of those 20,000 to be changed in some way in order to get one of these rare diseases. And 95% of these 7,000 kinds of rare diseases don't have any kind of treatment options. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that they impact so few people that there's just not a lot known about them. And the research and the money isn't there. I'd like to take some time now and just discuss a few of the rare diseases just so we can get a little bit of an idea of what we're talking about here. And the first one I want to talk about is cystic fibrosis. We've discussed cystic fibrosis in some of the previous videos, but it is also considered to be a rare disease because it affects about 35,000 people at a given time. And the gene culprit here is the CTFR gene, which stands for cystic fibrosis transmembrane conductance regulator. Now, the normal copies of these genes are responsible for water absorption and secretion, and the polymorphisms, and polymorphism is a fancy term for saying mutation, or we can call it our faulty gene. These are not going to do water absorption and secretion properly, and they actually end up creating a thick, sticky mucus, which then gets stuck inside of the lungs and causes a lot of problems. This polymorphism is considered to be autosomal recessive, and what this means is that you have to have two copies of the faulty gene in order to have cystic fibrosis. And so this is an example of a case where you can be a carrier, so this means you have one copy of the faulty gene and one copy of the regular gene, and so you're not expressing the disease, you don't have cystic fibrosis, but you do have the possibility of transmitting the faulty gene or the diseased gene to your offspring. So if you were to have a baby with someone else who is also a carrier, so that means that the partner has one copy of the bad gene, so to speak, and one copy of the regular gene, then your children have a 25% chance of having cystic fibrosis and a 50% chance of being a carrier. So this is an example of how your genetics might not cause you to have the disease, but it can impact heredity and how you might pass along the faulty genes, and your kids might be the ones that get sick. The next rare disease we're going to talk about is Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. And Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, like cystic fibrosis, which is diagnosed by the time you are age 2, if you haven't had a genetic test for it already, is also considered to be a childhood illness because it is diagnosed by the time you're age 4. It is a rare disease because it impacts 1 in 3,500 boys, and the gene culprit here is the DMD gene, which codes for a protein called dystrophin. Dystrophin is a structural protein, and one of the jobs that it has is to connect the center of the muscle to the outside of the cell, which provides muscle stability. It is considered to be an X-linked gene, which means that it is found on the X chromosome, and it is also considered to be recessive because you need to have two copies of the faulty gene in order to have Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. Now this one is different than the cystic fibrosis because it is X-linked, so it's on a sex chromosome. And if you remember back to basic biology, boys have an X and a Y, and girls have an X and an X chromosome. And so because boys only have one copy of the X chromosome, they are more likely to have Duchenne's muscular dystrophy than girls. And this is because it is a recessive gene. So when you only have one copy of the gene, the one copy that you have, whether it is faulty or whether it is the regular gene, is going to be expressed, where with girls, they have two X's, one from the dad, one from the mom, which means that they have a chance of having a regular. So they're going to have two copies of the bad gene in order to have Duchenne's muscular dystrophy, and that's just not very common. The polymorphisms of this gene prevent the protein dystrophin from being produced, which means that there is a lot of muscle weakness. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about rare diseases that manifest themselves in adulthood. And the first one is BRCA1, BRCA2 cancer. 1 in 400 women will have a faulty copy of either the BRCA1 or the BRCA2 gene, and this results in about 5 to 10% of all breast cancer cases. This gene is different in the fact that it is autosomal dominant, which means that you only have to have one copy of the faulty gene in order to have an increased risk of breast or ovarian cancer. The normal copy of the gene acts as a tumor suppressant, which means that it is what helps to prevent you from getting cancer, and it also acts in genome repair, which is one of the ways that it helps to be a tumor suppressant. Now, the faulty copy gives you an increased risk of developing breast or ovarian cancer. It does not mean that you're 100% going to have ovarian cancer or breast cancer, but your risk does increase. So you have a 1 in 40 chance of getting breast cancer if you are an Ashkenazi Jew, and an 80% chance of developing breast cancer or ovarian cancer by the time you're age 70. And the risk changes depending on if you have the BRCA1 or the BRCA2 gene. The last rare disease that we're going to focus on today, remember there's 7,000, we can't go through all 7,000, is familial adenomatous polyposis, which is FAP. This is a rare disease that affects about 1 in 8,000 people, and it is considered to be a cancer predisposition syndrome. The gene culprit here is the APC gene, which, like the BRCA1 and 2 genes, is autosomal dominant, which means that you have to have just one copy of the faulty gene in order to have FAP. The normal gene function is involved in cell adhesion, cell migration, and cell invasion. So basically, it keeps the cells where they belong and doesn't allow them to migrate. When you have cancer, the cells tend to migrate. That's part of what makes them cancerous cells. It also acts in angiogenesis, which means that it helps to create more blood vessels. And kind of like the BRCA1 and the BRCA2 gene, it is also a tumor suppressor. Now, this disease is a little bit different because you will get polyps in your teens, so it's kind of childhood, and if you don't get those treated, then you have almost 100% chance of having colon cancer, which will manifest itself in your older age by the time your mid-30s to your 40s. So this is kind of a combination of a childhood illness that can manifest into an adult illness if it is not taken care of. Part of why we wanted to talk about rare diseases in conjunction with understanding your own genetics is in celebration of Rare Disease Day, which is on February 28th. Remember that there are 7,000 different kinds of rare diseases that impact 30 million Americans, and that 95% of these do not have a treatment option. So on February 28th, we ask that everybody wear their stripes so we can bring attention to these rare diseases, and hopefully we can bring the research that will bring treatment options to those that are impacted by a rare disease.